Welcome to the first video in our biology unit. Today we're going to be talking about one of the basic building blocks of our brain and nervous system in general, and that is the neuron. A simple definition is a nerve cell, and you'll see me often just refer to it as a brain cell as well. It's one of the one type of brain cell that we have. It's the main one that we focus on for the AP curriculum. And to any neuroscientists that are out there, apologies up front. This is a very simple Psych 101 presentation of how a neuron fires, leaving out much of the molecular and chemical nuances and complicated ideas that may be there. So anyway, so we're going to be talking about today about basically how neurons communicate with each other. You have to understand that there are, billions of neurons with trillions of connections in the brain. And so this is a grossly oversimplified view of how a neuron fires. We're going to be talking as if one neuron is communicating with one other neuron and receiving information from a third neuron. And that's way overly simplified, but it's going to just help us in the kind of our process of discussing this. So as we look at this neuron, we're going to be basically going over structures from left to right on the screen and talking about exactly what they do in order for messages to be, travel along this neuron and get sent to the next neuron. Neurons are electrochemical in nature. They receive chemical messages from other neurons, and then within a single neuron itself, it sends an electrical signal down its body. And so we'll start off talking about these dendrites, these tentacles over on the left-hand side of the screen. These are the receivers of the neuron. They're gathering information from, hundreds, if not thousands of surrounding neurons. And again, that information is chemical in nature. It's chemical molecules that they're absorbing from these neurons. We'll get into that in a little bit more detail in just a second. But essentially, to grossly oversimplify, dendrites are receiving basically two types of messages. They're receiving what we call excitatory messages, and they're receiving what we call inhibitory messages. And for each neuron, it has a different threshold of the ratio of excitatory to inhibitory messages that it needs to receive in order to be able to fire. But whatever the threshold is, and just for simplification purposes, we'll say here that for this neuron, if it just receives any more excitatory messages than inhibitory, then it's going to fire. An excitatory message is a message from another neuron that's telling this neuron, fire, fire, fire. You need to send this message. Inhibitory are messages coming in from other neurons that are saying, slow down, we don't need to fire, trying to prevent the fire from occurring. And so if this neuron reaches its threshold, its right ratio of excitatory over inhibitory, it's going to fire. And this is what we call an all or nothing response. And what we mean by an all or nothing response is it's not like if it receives a lot more excitatory messages than inhibitory that the strength of the signal is going to be stronger or anything along those lines. It either fires or it doesn't. And that way it's much like a gun. The firing of a bullet is not based on how hard you pull the trigger. You either pull it hard enough to fire or you don't pull it hard enough to fire and it doesn't fire at all. So it's that type of all or nothing response. So it's receiving all these messages. And then they come to the cell body. We're not going to focus too much in this class on the cell body, sometimes referred to as the soma. This is simply, like any other cell in the body, it is basically the life support. It's going to be, taking in nutrients and making sure the cell is staying healthy. Because remember, brain cells are unlike many other cells throughout the body, in that the brain cells that you have when you're a little kid are, for the most part, the brain cells that you're going to have when you die. They don't regenerate. They don't replace themselves. We used to think that you didn't generate any new brain cells throughout your lifetime. That is no longer considered to be the case. We'll get into that in a different portion of this unit. But there's some of the oldest cells in your body, certainly as you get older and older. Some outer cells, such as skin cells, are replenishing themselves very quickly. But neurons are a type of cell that doesn't really replenish itself at all. You have what you were born with. In fact, you actually have a little less than what you're born with, but we'll get into that in a different unit as well. All right, so it's receiving all these messages. Let's imagine that this neuron has reached its threshold and it is going to fire. And so as it fires, it is sending out an electrical impulse down the axon. The axon is this long singular branch away from the cell body, and it is carrying that electrical signal. And what's happening here, we call this neural impulse an action potential, the actual electrical signal traveling down the axon. And it doesn't travel all at once. You'll notice that this axon is broken into one that kind of looks like little sausage pieces, and at each level or each piece of this axon is going to have its own triggering mechanism that's going to open up and allow the action potential to continue as it flows down the axon itself. The way this happens at a chemical level, you have positive ions on the outside or surrounding the axon, these positive potassium ions on the outside for the most part. On the inside, you have a majority of negative sodium ions, and once the signal has been received and it's going to fire, there is a depolarization process in which the selective membrane of the axon allows in some of the positive ions on the outside. It becomes more balanced and more positive on the inside, allowing for that electrical impulse to carry through. One of the things that helps this electrical impulse to travel down the axon in an efficient manner is a fatty tissue that is surrounding the axon that we call the myelin sheath. The myelin sheath acts just like insulation on a wire. Insulation on a wire, one of its purposes is to allow for the electrical signal within the wire to travel more quickly and more efficiently, and not to get degraded or lost because of the lack of insulation. So the myelin sheath serves the same purpose here and keeps the electrical impulse, the action potential, traveling down the axon. In fact, there are some disorders that are associated with a demyelinization in which the myelin sheath is basically going away around an axon, and the neurons aren't able to fire in the way that they once did. Once this action potential reaches the end of the axon, it's then going to go into these various terminal branches of the axon. And at these terminal branches, we're going to start to see this electrical impulse being basically triggering a response that's going to allow a chemical message to be sent to surrounding neurons. So the reason we have all these branches at the end is so that this one neuron can communicate to multiple other neurons that are surrounding it. And to get a little bit more up close and personal about what's happening at these terminal branches, we'll head on over to the next slide. I meant to have these boxes deleted for you, so let me do that real quick. And now at the end of each terminal branch, we have basically these little terminal buttons, the very end of the terminal branch of the axon. And what you'll notice if you look closely is that the terminal button at the end of each terminal branch doesn't actually touch the dendrites of the next neuron. And instead, there is a small gap that we call the synaptic gap that exists between the sending neuron and the receiving neuron. And this is why we call this an electrical chemical system. Through the neuron, it was an electrical signal. Now that it's reached the terminal branches, there is going to be a chemical signal sent to the next neuron. These chemical signals that we call are what we call neurotransmitters. There are a variety of neurotransmitters that the human body produces. We'll end up needing to know about 5 or 6 of them for the purpose of this class. But what you need to understand is at this point, these neurotransmitters are being released from the sending neuron, and there are receptor sites at the receiving neuron that are set up specifically to receive a specific type of neurotransmitter. It's kind of like a lock and key in that regard. In other words, not every neurotransmitter will be accepted at a receptor site. It has to be the right neurotransmitter at the right receptor site. Now, the body trying to be efficient, it's going to release these chemicals into the synaptic gap. Some of them are going to be absorbed. Some of them are not going to be absorbed, and they're going to be floating around in the synaptic gap. The sending neuron then takes us through a process called reuptake. And reuptake is when the sending neuron is reabsorbing excess neurotransmitters back into the terminal branch as a means of basically efficiency and maintaining those neurotransmitters to use at a later time. And so that's the basics of how a neurotransmitter or a neuron, fires. If you have any questions about this, you can email me at ghsteacher@gmail.com, or you can ask them in class. Otherwise, have a good night.